We will be passing those on to Planned Parenthood, as well as 20% of any sales of the 3 books by the authors who are on our panel tonight, which you can buy at the register back there. If you're on the live stream, of course, feel free to donate to Planned Parenthood of Massachusetts directly, and thank you so much for being on the live stream. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists. We have Annie Cardi, the author of Winter White, Scarlet Letter, retelling Red, and The Chance You Won't Return. Her books have been included on the Kids Indie Next list, the YALSA Best Fiction for Young Adults list, and named among the Bank Street College of Education Best Books of the Year. Meghan Elizabeth Kallman is the co-founder and co-director of Conceivable Future and co-author of the book of the same name. She serves as the state senator for Rhode Island's 15th district and is an associate professor at the School for Global Inclusion and Social Development at UMass Boston. Marlene Gerber-Fried is, I didn't ask you if it's Fried or Fried.
Fried.
I have a German last name. I have no excuse.
That's not even my name.
Marlene Gerber-Fried is a professor emerita of philosophy at Hampshire College and co-founder of the National Network of Abortion Funds. Loretta J. Ross is a MacArthur Fellow, Associate Professor of Women and Gender at Smith College, and co-founder of Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Health Collective. They are co-authors with Jael Silliman and Elena Gutierrez of Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organized for Reproductive Justice, and you'll see their new book on the table here today. Mason Dunn, the Vice President of Public Affairs for Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts and the Executive Director of the Planned Parenthood Advocacy Fund of Massachusetts. A lawyer, educator, and advocate, Mason has dedicated their career to health equity and access, particularly in the LGBTQ+ community. Mason now leads the advocacy arm of Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts. So thank you, this stellar lineup, for being here. And to kick us off, I would also like to welcome, please, Caroline Kimball-Katz of the Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts. Can folks hear me? Okay, like this? Okay. I just want to hold the mic like that. Well, thank you again for welcoming PPLM into this space. My name's Caroline. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the communications director at PPLM. And I'm so excited to be here because I'm also just a lover of the Booksmith. I did like all my Christmas shopping here. So thank you for welcoming us in. It's cool to wear my work hat at an event here. And we get to hear from some brilliant authors and local leaders tonight. So this is just really exciting. I definitely want to thank the Booksmith. Alex said some of the proceeds for tonight are being donated directly to PPLM. They have been a really great community partner to us. And if you don't know, our Boston Health Center is literally a mile down the street. So we are very much in this community, and they have been incredible collaborators. Community is a really, really important word for us right now. The growing threats to our healthcare, the services PPLM provides, all of our rights, our communities, the targeted attacks on Planned Parenthood by the Trump administration and his allies really, I think, underscores why we are here and may have asked for your support and potentially to donate later. But we're only getting stronger, and we're only able to be here because of our community, because of our local support, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that. In case you didn't know, in July of last year, President Trump and his allies signed a law that blocked all federal Medicaid reimbursement dollars from going to Planned Parenthood health centers. And that means, since the federal government already does not support abortion services with federal funding, that means that law is blocking people who use Medicaid from getting birth control, pap smears, STI testing and treatment, other routine care like hormone therapy at Planned Parenthood, which is so many people's provider of choice. We know they are trying by any means possible to force providers that provide abortion care, gender-affirming care, to shut our doors, and we obviously refuse to do that. So because of the support from local donors, community partners, and our state government, we have been able to continue care for all patients so far at PPLM, provide thousands of appointments free of charge for Medicaid patients, and even expand services when patients asked. For example, we are starting vasectomy services on Valentine's Day this year. So we're doing this all in the midst of these attacks, listening to patients, what they're asking us for, what they're telling us they need, and that matters now more than ever. And lastly, I'll just say sexual and reproductive health care providers, abortion providers like Planned Parenthood, like Women's Health Services, which is about a mile in the opposite direction in Brookline Village, they are essential pillars of community, every community. We cannot afford to lose them, frankly, and so I know tonight's discussion is going to touch on that, dig into why that is and how we create the equitable future that we know we are going to demand for our rights, our freedom, our health care. So I just thank, again, these authors for being here, the Booksmith for creating this space for this conversation, and if you are not already a Planned Parenthood supporter, consider becoming one tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Alex.
All right. Now, this can be rather quick, but I'd love to go down the line and just have each of you talk about how your work has intersected with questions of reproductive rights, reproductive justice, and legislation, healthcare, where that's been part of your professional, and if you feel comfortable, personal life.
Can you hear me now? Yes. The answer to that question is yes, that is my life. That is my work. I am so honored to be able to work for Planned Parenthood, to be a voice in the State House for reproductive health and sexual health and all of the communities that we serve. It is my job to lift up the voices and stories of our patients and our communities in a way that advocates and progresses our rights and preserves our rights to fundamental and, in Massachusetts, constitutionally protected health care. And so that is the basis of my work. I will say, on the personal side of things, as a trans person, as a non-binary transmasculine person right now, things are really scary, y'all. Like, it's a wild time. And I feel so honored to be able to say that I am doing this work day in and day out with colleagues and providers who stand beside me in the work. And so that personal level, it's the personal is political, the political is personal in this moment, and just being able to do something about it with the support of my organization and this community keeps me going.
I feel really humbled to be in this group of people doing such active, important work. I'm kind of on the side of, I write young adult fiction. My book, Red, deals with a young woman who, it's a retelling of the Scarlet Letter, and so this is a teen girl who, in the beginning of the book, she has an abortion. Someone in her youth group finds out about it, and she's shunned for that. And I think in writing it, I wanted to portray a young person who is in a situation where she knows this is the right decision for her to make. And she is also someone who is in a religious community. And I think for me, in writing it, and then, you know, when my agent and I were on submission for it, we talked a lot about kind of that intersection between reproductive rights and conversations about abortion, and, you know, specifically in this book, Christian groups and how readers would experience that. And I think now, as the book is out, it's been really gratifying to see readers of all ages, both current teen readers, you know, adult readers, people who are, you know, much older than I am, getting to start conversations based on this and based on Tessa's situation.
I think, as Mason said, yes. The Conceivable Future, the organization in the book, emerged when my colleague and dear friend Josephine, who couldn't be here tonight, she and I were both 29, 30, trying to think about what it means to consider parenting and families in an era of rapidly unspooling climate crisis, and then to get familiar with the justice discourses and the injustices in history, everything that sort of led us to this moment, right? From an economic history perspective to a gendered and racialized oppression history perspective, everything that goes into that. but also with a very specific threat of climate change hanging over the heads of people who are of reproductive age right now. So we started this group quite a long time ago, 13 years ago now, and it represents, the book here is everything that we've learned and talked to people about over the course of the last decade and a half, and experiences of people who are parents and who aren't parents and who are wistful grandparents and who are, not parenting against their will and who are parenting against the whole mess, right? And so the idea has always been to have constructive conversations about like what all of us are bringing into this moment and how we can work towards a world that is safer for everybody's children. It doesn't matter if they're mine or yours, or like how do we create a world in which every child who comes next meets with a habitable planet that respects their identity, their sovereignty, their bodily autonomy, that is healthy, that is safe, and what are the steps that we take to get there. So those are some of the same reasons that I serve in the Senate. And so I think my own biography is like a little bit of a weird mix, right, between personal and organizing. But I was this woman. I was born in a girl's body and came of age with all of the reproductive challenges and sexual violence and everything that implies. And so like I carry that with me in everything I do. That's also not an escapable part of this.
Thank you. Like Mason and Meghan, the personal and political are all tied together. The second wave feminism didn't make that up. It's something that we just understood about living in this world. But most of my adult life has been spent as a political activist for reproductive health, rights, and justice before we had the language of justice. So I spent many a cold winter morning in front of the Planned Parenthood clinic right down the street. And I know there are others in this room who were there with me, and trying to keep each other warm, trying to do what we called clinic defense, which was a little bit more like hand-to-hand combat with the people who wanted to block people from getting abortions. So in terms of my own biography, I came to abortion work out of experiences of pregnancy loss. I'd never had an abortion, but I had miscarriages, and I could not have explained to you, I didn't have the concept of bodily autonomy, so I couldn't have explained to you why I was making that connection. But for me, it was an embodied connection between not being able to be pregnant when I wanted to be pregnant and people being pregnant when they didn't want to be pregnant. So that's on the personal side. On the political side, mostly I've been on the, what was then, but not anymore, the fringes of the movement for abortion rights, the choicey part of the movement. But that was never a concept that resonated for me. And justice has a lot more to do, having come from the civil rights movement for racial justice and women's liberation, justice made a lot more sense, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. And then Loretta and I have been collaborators, co-conspirators, friends since the 80s? Since the 80s. And we've written together, and we've fought together, and we've dreamed together. And this book is kind of the culmination of all of that. I've taught, I think I live and breathe reproductive health, rights, and justice.
You certainly do. Hi. 50 years ago, 1973, the same year as Roe v. Wade, a doctor decided that I shouldn't have any more kids, and he sterilized me. And that got my attention, to be honest. And so that started a whole career, first fighting against sterilization abuse, and then segueing into fighting for abortion rights, and seeing the whole question of bodily autonomy as central to why I feel I have to devote my life to making sure that what happened to me doesn't continue to happen. But I do want to say that I'm mad because when I was 16 and needed an abortion, I was able to have a perfectly safe and legal one in 1970 in Washington, D.C. at the Washington Hospital Center, because D.C. decriminalized abortion 3 years before Roe v. Wade. And so it really pisses me off that younger women, my grandchildren's age, have fewer rights than I had in 1970. So it's all part of fighting fascism. And as I was driving here today, I said we couldn't even have this conversation in Minnesota right now because ICE would be at the door. You know, and so we have to make sure we use all the privilege we have to speak up and make the connections between all the issues. Because it's not just about gender. It's about democracy. It's about race. It's about peace. It's about the viability of the planet. It's all the same fight.
Wonderful. Now I have a question for each of you, and I'm going to sort of work down the line, although Mason, I'm going to end with you. Annie, in your books, you tackle challenging subjects for young audiences. And as you said, Red is explicitly a contemporary YA retelling of the Scarlet Letter. So as a writer engaging with young audiences, have you been able to see in your readers the effects of rape culture and slut shaming on young women and other young people who are impacted by those social forces?
I mean, I definitely, it's a part of life for, you know, it's been a part of life for teens now, previously. I do appreciate, again, the conversations, at least I have with readers. I feel like I don't want to speak too broadly, but again, people being able to be open about specifically abuse and kind of slut shaming and young people being shamed for existing in their own bodies. And I do think, again, like at least, you know, I hope that fiction is a good way for people to start to have those conversations with each other and find that a lot of people, you know, particularly young people, but, you know, throughout the years, you're also having similar experiences when it comes to kind of experiencing that kind of shame and abuse. And so much of that makes people feel deeply isolated. And I think at least in Red, I wanted to kind of look at what happens when someone who is feeling extremely isolated tries to form a community and connect with other people who are maybe experiencing similar things, and kind of the strength of coming together and finding solidarity and support.
And I think we'll find as the conversation continues, and probably already in many people's experience, that drive towards community is really the sort of redemptive force that we have going for us, because there will always be people in power who want to break that community and take away those options. Thank you. Meghan, can you talk a bit about how, as an author, an activist, and a politician, you've seen issues of reproductive rights and bodily autonomy play out in the last, decade or two that you've been really active in this sphere? And I know you're in Rhode Island, but as we were talking before the event, there is some overlap in the experiences throughout some parts of New England, although some parts of New England are slightly different.
And a few Rhode Islanders in the audience. Yeah, so again, I got into this work, I mean, I had an abortion when I was 27, somewhere in there. And I've had a couple of miscarriages too, so like all the, you live all the stuff. But again, Josephine and I actually met at a house concert that our friend Jamie was playing music at. They had written some music to accompany a physicist lecture on dark matter. On marimbas that they built. And Josephine was in town from New York, and our friend Jamie kind of grabbed us both by the elbow, and she was like, you guys are both climate people, you should talk. So we sit in the corner instead of listening to the concert, we talked to each other for 2 hours. And then the next weekend she came back up from New York and hung out with me, and we hammered out what ultimately became an organization called Conceivable Future, which is based on one question, how do we think about our responsibility to ourselves, each other, and the next generation, from a parenting and family and kinship perspective, given the climate crisis? And so I kind of on-ramped into my political, reproductive-centered organizing through the climate lens, because I was a climate activist before I was other kinds of activist. But as Loretta said, right, it's all of the piece, right? The same forces that drive the sort of unabated unspooling of the climate are the same forces that are trying to take away people's rights, that are trying to break us away from our neighbors, that are trying to arrest our other neighbors, trying to throw people in jail, trying to throw people in cages, trying to, whatever it is that they're trying to do, take away housing, right? Like, when you pull on one thread, the rest of it puckers, right? So movements for justice, it doesn't mean everybody has to do everything all at the same time. That's also a recipe for burnout, but that it is incumbent on us to recognize the ways in which my work in environment and climate specifically is also related to, for instance, my legislative agenda, which has been heavily focused on housing in the last couple of years, because you know what? If you don't have a place to live, all of the other stuff feels very, 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 very secondary, right? And that's also a thing that, like, I come from. We didn't have a safe place to live for a chunk of my childhood, and so all of this stuff feels really personal. So I can, you know, the Meghan Qua politician can go tell very personal stories about almost every issue that I work on, which is perhaps one of the curses of being an extrovert. But the point is that, like, again, all of the things matter to each other, and so work for justice, well, not everyone has to do everything all the time. We do all have to do it with an eye towards how our work is interlocking. So Rhode Island codified the right to abortion in state law in 2019, excuse me. And 2 years ago, we also passed the Equality and Abortion Coverage Act, which is basically the opposite of what the new Trump thing did, that anybody who is on state Medicaid in Rhode Island can actually use their Medicaid dollars for reproductive health care coverage, including abortion, because that's why it's called Equality and Abortion Coverage. But we have also tried to expand that to think about not just reproductive rights, but access. So for instance, as this crew is probably aware, right, there's radical racial differences in birth outcomes and maternal mortality and infant mortality. One of the big predictors of a decrease in that disparity is the presence of doulas. So 2 years ago, we made it possible to cover doulas with health insurance, right? So stuff like that. It's a little bit boring, a little bit in the weeds, but looking at not just sort of like the big political landscape and the existential crises with which we are all faced, but like, what does that look like on the ground? Okay, so in Rhode Island, it's 60 miles wide. Like, most people can go get an abortion, but we have disparities in maternal and infant mortality. How do we look at that? How do we do that better? You know, again, I work here in Boston. I live and legislate in Rhode Island, and so there's a lot of things that are quite similar. I think, you know, culturally, New England certainly is more liberal. But I was raised in New Hampshire, right, which is a very, in some places very poor, and in many places very libertarian place. My experience actually of that part of the world is that it's less hateful and more hands-off. At least it was in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up. And so we have some work to do too with connecting with each other. Excuse me. We have some work to do in connecting with each other along the lines where we can find common ground. I was talking to my partner on the way up about some of the barriers I think that progressive organizing faces, and one of the big ones to me is the unwillingness or inability to work with people who you don't like, because guess what? All of the big successful social movements involve a lot of collaboration with people that you don't like and with whom you don't see eye to eye all the time, right? So there is a degree of, like, I think, flexing or building up those muscles that we're gonna need to do, and I can talk about that later, but I think I've taken time.
Thank you. Marlene and Loretta, your book is both a history of where we've been and a set of ideas about both where we're at and where we need to be. So you cover a lot of ground, which is fantastic, and it's a pretty new book, so I bet a lot of you haven't read it yet. One of the books that we have copies of, you should definitely check it out. We've already talked a bit about this, but how do you see the curtailing of reproductive rights as both its own tragedy and a canary in the coal mine? How often does that particular issue land at the forefront of not the beginning of, but one of the first things that people really take note of? And why do they take note of that when other injustices have been ongoing?
So if you think about it, reproduction has been a fault line since colonialism, because the idea of colonialism was to not make America great again, make America white for white people. And so that's about reproduction. It's about who's going to have children, whose children are valuable, who will we encourage to have children, and who will we discourage. So genocide against Native Americans, because we don't want all those Native American children. So I think that as a recurrent theme throughout history, you see that over and over. And of course, now you're seeing it with all of this panic about the Great Replacement Theory, the so-called Great Replacement Theory, that people are trying to replace white people. Not true. And one of the myths, I mean, deconstructing the myths around reproduction is an ongoing enterprise. So I think there's that. I think in addition, if you think about your own reproductive experiences, and we've already got some on the table, sterilization, birth, abortion, and there are many more. We haven't even talked about getting your period. You know, there's just like a lot of things going on. And to the extent that you think about your own, they're not isolated incidents in your life. It's a tapestry of reproduction. It's a tapestry of oppression, and racial disparities are up and down each of those experiences. So one of the reasons that it was important for us to write this book was to expand people's lens, so that if you're thinking about, you're not just thinking about abortion as the frontline reproductive issue, because it's not. For historically, the right to have children and the right to raise them in the way that you want to, in health and with care and with everything else you need, has been the frontline issue for many communities. So reproductive justice is for us a bridge to bringing together people who may not see themselves in the same room all the time. Do you want to? And I just want to say one thing, because Loretta mentioned the sterilization. Roe v. Wade, the movement to get legal abortion was happening at exactly the same time that women of color-led organizations were fighting against sterilization abuse, against involuntary coercive sterilization. But if you were in the abortion movement, you would not have known that. So and it's actually, once you think about it, you're like, that is remarkable.
And what is even more remarkable is if you're a woman of color, they would gladly pay for you to get sterilized today.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's always about having different racialized destinies. And so the purpose of the book was to create a retelling of a history that was intersectional, that intersected race, gender, colonialism, citizenship, the laws, the resistance to those laws, and all of those things in a different kind of narrative. Because even our present fight for abortion rights today was animated by a certain political party wanting to build a coalition of Christian nationalism, which they found abortion and race were a good bridge to build that coalition with, so that now we see, the fascism that was always the end goal. So permanent power is actually the end goal. And so, but if you don't understand those bridges and those manipulations of people's personal autonomies and their fears, what is interesting to me about abortion politics today is that in red state after red state, we have white women voting for abortion rights and for Trump at the same time. And there is a disconnect there that is urgently needed to be addressed by the abortion rights movement. I would argue that our historical practices have left out conversations with the very poor white women that come into our clinics. And so they have been seduced into voting against their own interests on every issue till it comes to abortion rights. So we've got a lot of work to do. But one other thing you had said, Megan, that I wanted to do my own commercial on. It's very hard to produce 2 books in 1 year, so. Marlene did the primary writing on this one while I was writing a book called Calling In, How to Start Making Change with Those You'd Rather Cancel. Because I got a whole lot of people I love canceling. And I have to call myself in over and over again when, they, what's that, FAFO, they effed around and found out, and yet I still got to talk to them. And so this book is how you do that. And so that's the commercial.
Fantastic, thank you. Mason, Planned Parenthood has long been a gold standard in reproductive care, as well as other kinds of health care, including gender-confirming care that face substantial political backlash. Caroline was talking about the fairly recent federal defunding. So how have you seen that impact on patients, even in Massachusetts? And what does that mean for Planned Parenthood's mission? An answer that I hope I can anticipate, but I would like to hear you say it. Yeah.
First and foremost, we are not going anywhere. And there's so much fear around the defund, around the federal attacks of, is Planned Parenthood going to be there when I show up to the clinic? And the fact is, we're not going anywhere. We are in this fight with community, for community, and in this together for healthcare for all here. So I think that that's important to say and to reaffirm and reassure folks that we are not stopping. They can defund us, they can attack us, they can go to the courts, they can send their activists to our front door. We are not going to stop because these rights are fundamental. And I think everybody in the building at Planned Parenthood in our 4 offices across Massachusetts would say that wholeheartedly. And so I think that's really important to say and remind and to speak to the fear through empathy, compassion, and care. And I think as folks were talking, I was writing some notes, and one of the notes I wrote, I think when Meghan was speaking, is that empathy is our greatest asset in this moment. To have empathy for one another, for the communities we serve. And I just want to lift that up, especially with the comment about calling in. Having empathy for one another and love for one another, even when we disagree, I think is so important and is another part of the care that I know so many of our providers at Planned Parenthood want to ensure and impart to the communities we serve. So in terms of, where are we going, what do we do from here? We're going to continue to tell our stories, and this is another really important point from the perspective of an advocate and somebody who spends probably too much time in the State House, although not the most amount of time in at the table, but more time in the Massachusetts State House, is that our stories are such an amazing piece of power. Telling your story, and I'm sure a lot of folks here, not just at the table, but in the audience, you may have a story about Planned Parenthood, whether it was you volunteered or you received care there, or you have a family member who sought care at one of our offices across the country and any of the affiliates. Those stories are so important to lift up right now. So I please encourage you to reach out to us to just tell us. We want to hear those stories. I'm going to speak for Caroline here. When we get those emails from folks like, hey, your office did this thing for me or for my family member, or I canvassed with you and it meant so much to me. We love those stories and we will always respond. It might be me, it might be Caroline, it might be somebody, but we will always respond because that keeps us, the staff, going, keeps our providers going, and the legislators in the State House need to hear it. They need to hear about that power. So I really encourage you to tell your story, to get involved as much as possible, because that, just as much as donations, that kind of work will keep us going. It keeps our hearts going, it keeps the legislators going who support us, and so it's so vitally important. So I think that I covered a little bit of ground there. Like I said before though, we're not gonna stop. So.
Well, I think a couple of points have been have been touched on several times, and I think both you and Loretta have talked about the fact that there is no protection in silence, and so being vocal and being active in the face of potential blowback is really important, which of course is one of the reasons that I really appreciate that we're able to be here tonight, that you're choosing to be here tonight. But in terms of making yourself heard, and in terms of using the power that we have as individuals and communities, what do you all see as some of the things you do, but also some of the things that the rest of us can do? Anyone can answer that.
I wanted to lift up the work that I do with this group called Women Help Women, which is an international group educating people about abortion medicines and helping them get them in places where it's absolutely illegal. Not yet here, but coming your way. And there are people all over that are part of this work. In terms of thinking about the community, one of the things that's happened in this moment of multiple oppressions is that you see the communities coming together. You see this in Minnesota. The people keep coming out in the face of this ridiculous outpouring of fascist power. The community is coming out. In terms of the rolling back of abortion rights, the people are coming everywhere. Networks from the developing world to the US, bringing medicines across borders from Mexico to Texas. So it is, to me, this is what inspires me, but it also is something that everyone can do. Everyone in this room should learn about the abortion pills, should find out how to get them, and then tell everybody you ever meet so that they can tell other people, so you can tell other people. So that's, in some ways, that's the most fundamental part of building community and networking. I think for me, the abortion funds themselves, raising money, was sort of the same thing, in a way. You know, one of the problems with Rhode, and the reason it was never enough, is it didn't give access. Not just access to housing and food and education, but it didn't give access to abortion care to everyone, only to people who could afford it. So we do have a chance now, I hate to say it, build back better, I mean, to get laws that actually serve us and serve everybody, not just some of us. So I think that those are all, the fight is everywhere. It's at your holiday table. It's with the people who don't agree with you. And it's with your allies, because everyone needs their choir. You know, you need people to stand with you so you can keep doing it. Do you want to say anything?
I was just going to jump in, because you actually raised one of the points that I was about to raise, which is like having these conversations around the kitchen table, around the holiday table. I know we just had the holidays. There is so much disinformation out there. And we have to educate ourselves so that we can then take that message and spread it amongst the folks who, in our own networks, who may be susceptible to that disinformation. There is an outright attack on evidence-based science right now. And it is so appalling to see things that are very clearly evidence-based and peer-reviewed, and we know it to be true, and yet so many people don't really read it and rather listen to the disinformation, because they're doing a really good job of packaging it in a way that makes it real believable. And so I think learning the talking points, learning about what science is there, and then spreading it with our networks, whether it's our social media or at the kitchen table, is so vitally important to fight back against the disinformation that we see every day on so many networks and channels.
But I want to take it a step further.
Yeah.
It's not just that the disinformation is there, but people only believe information from people they already trust. And so our fundamental job isn't to give them more information, but to prove ourselves trustworthy of, to have empathy and compassion for them, no matter how misled we think they are. Because if we humiliate them for their lack of information, we could keep throwing information up against the wall and nothing will stick. And so we have to call ourselves in, sorry to reuse my own phrase, but because the manipulators are expert at falsely making people believe that they care about them. And we sometimes give the impression that we care more about the facts. You know, but the facts don't matter if we act in an untrustworthy way and weaponize those facts against their disinformation and ignorance. So we have to call ourselves in. I want to call out the puppeteers, but I want to call in the puppets, you know, and weaken the puppeteers.
I'm so glad that you all brought this up, and I think for especially young people, I think there's so much misinformation online that is coming at it from the perspective of it seems so kind of cozy and nice and talking about, you know, being natural and suspicion on, you know, pills and medications, and it's coming from this like real whitewashed cottagecore perspective, but is deeply disingenuous. And I think the you know, the reaction that I have is to argue and want to present a bunch of facts. And a colleague had mentioned years ago in relation to kind of social justice work, a phrase, listen to learn and not to respond. And I try to hold that in because I'm like, oh, that's so hard for me. I just want to jump in and respond. But for those people who you can have actual conversations with, to listen to learn and kind of see where they're coming from and be curious and ask questions and be a safe space for them, because the framing around this misinformation seems so safe and approachable, and trying to find the same approach as an individual.
I love all this. I wanna step into step with Loretta here, and go maybe a bit more basic, which I would say the work of the moment is make friends. The work of the moment is know your neighbors, right? In order to become trustworthy, you have to know who's next door. When the power goes out, you need to be able to know who is there. And if there is somebody on oxygen, you need to be able to know to check on that person, right? And okay, I'm an elder millennial, right? And so we're this sort of like funny hinge generation where like we like our phones, but like we still know how to talk on them instead of tech, right? But go bring your neighbors some cookies, right? Start real basic. This is the kind of thing, when I knock doors, one of the things that I hear most frequently is like, God, I wish I knew my neighbors. And then I will say again, that like, as an extrovert, there's a piece of me that's like, well, go meet your neighbors, right? Go say hi. And for reasons that range from social media to the pandemic, that is challenging for some folks, right? But it remains a really, really necessary component. Our ability to be members of a community together is the foundation of everything. So I'm a sociologist as a day job. It's how I make my money, because in Rhode Island we don't really get paid very much for being legislators. There was a book written by a social movement scholar named Alden Morris. He studied the American Civil Rights Movement, and one of the main conclusions, he was writing around the same time as a guy named Doug McAdam, but together they were looking at like what made this American Civil Rights Movement so successful, and the answer was the Black church in the South, and not just because it was faith-based, it was primarily because people already knew and trusted each other, right? Like, you knew who the phone tree was in order to organize a carpool, because you knew who the phone tree was, because it was your turn it'd been your turn for potluck for however long, right? So like, people already had the skills, they already had the muscles of being community members that then enabled them to transfer those skills to social justice work, right? And there's been a lot of research in sociology and political science in subsequent years that basically tells the same story, right? That like, you have to know and love each other for your own sake, or know and tolerate each other for your own sake, because you share a part of the world together. Maybe that's a faith tradition, maybe that is a corner of like a neighborhood, maybe it is a building, maybe it is that your kids are at the same bus stop, or your dogs are at the same dog park, whatever it is. But those are the things upon which power is built, which means that when we divest from those things, the first thing we have to do is build back all that power of knowing who is on our street and on our block. And I think, honestly, for younger people, that is one of the bigger challenges. It's not glamorous work, but it is actually one of the reasons too why I find door knocking as unglamorous and as hot and as blister creating as it can be. Like very gender, you don't know who's behind those doors, and you're never gonna know unless you try to like make the effort to figure that out, right? And it's really, really beautiful. And in order to become trustworthy, again, we have to know each other's faces, we have to know each other's names, and we have to make ourselves responsible to and for each other in our interlocking networks of communities.
Thank you so much. Those were wonderful answers from everyone. We are already at 7:51, so I would love to open this up to audience questions. Right back there.
Yes, I'm Carol Diano. I used to live in Brookline up the street, but now I don't. And I want to respond both to the stories question and to, I founded a group about 7 or 8 years ago called the Bad Old Days Posse. And we are a group of women who go around and we tell anybody who will listen to us about our abortion stories before Roe, when we had to access the underground network. And so anybody who has an organization who'd like to hear from us, we'd be delighted to hear. Anyway, so
That's great.
Can I also just say, I'm putting on my trans advocacy hat for a moment. We need to learn the lessons from you about underground care and how you access care, because right now there's so much fear around gender affirming care that some of those stories can give a lot of hope to trans community who is fearful right now. Now let me also assuage any fears. Gender affirming care is still accessible and legal in this state, and gosh darn it, I'm gonna work like hell to make sure it stays that way. But you know, I was having a conversation last weekend with a friend of mine who lived through the AIDS crisis, and we were sharing stories about our fears and concerns about the health and well-being, and it is the stories of resilience and survival
and coming together as a community.
and coming together and caring for one another that is giving so many communities, including the trans and gender expansive community right now, hope. And so I want to thank you and cannot wait to hear some stories. Like, I'm very excited to connect.
And one other thing briefly that I wanted to respond to, your analysis was wonderful. I would perhaps go one step further and just talk about this as an assault on women, period, of whatever persuasion or race or whatever it is. The minute that you take women's reproductive autonomy away from them, then they can't be in the workplace. They're going to be stuck at home. We're going to have men, I know there are nice men here, but we're going to have men asserting their authority over women to decide what they're allowed to do.
That is the plan, actually.
That is the plan.
It's not just a bug.
So I think, just the whole idea that women are full human beings is something under attack.
But it isn't just what, that's true. But as Mason reminds us, I mean, the bridge to sorry, yes, it isn't, what I'm responding to is that yes, it is about women, but it's not just about women. Unfortunately, there's plenty of oppression to go around. And anybody who's trying to exercise bodily autonomy is on the chopping block.
Oh, you can't even walk down the street now
Yeah, exactly.
if you're not the right color and gender. Talk about bodily autonomy.
Can I jump in on that real quick too, around the stories, which I really appreciate. I'm gonna put on my senator hat for a second and say, stories are incredibly important, and also they are not the only kind of power that we need, right? And I think one of the, if you'll forgive me for putting it this way, like advocacy rookie mistakes is they say, go to the State House and tell your story, which really matters. But you know what also matters? If Planned Parenthood can stand up a challenger to the person who consistently votes against the Planned Parenthood bills, right? I'm sorry, like that's just how it is, right? And so I think, as someone who just wrote a book about stories, right, like they're clearly the cultural importance and the swaying and the moving of stories and the narrative and like how we tell things and who tells stories makes history and writes history. And also in the immediate term, if we are looking for gains, we need to figure out how to be more thoughtfully strategic, period. We just do, right? I I have a colleague who I think is fearing a challenging re-election season. And what did that person do? They went to Planned Parenthood and said, "Can I carry one of your bills?" That is a different exercise of power. And again, I think because the left, the political left generally like emphasizes being nice to each other, we try to, or at least we say we want to. We tend to shy away from some of this like very calculated power building, which again, you don't have to like everybody that you work with, but you do need to be able to pose a threat sometimes to somebody's, for instance, re-election campaign in order to get, like, meet the moment. And we're bad at that, and we need to be better at that.
And we don't all have to build power in the same way. If we act like a social movement, then there's room for everybody. There's room for art and culture and music and don't talk sideways, talk into it. And so if you think about the Green Wave in Latin America, it had many different people working on the inside, people working on the outside, and that's what what we've not actually had generally here is that kind of openness to other ways of doing things. Like, oh no, this is the only way to do it. Just tell your stories, or just lobby, or just vote. So we need to be more expansive in our strategies, but we're not letting you take control.
Oh, that's okay.
Well, we spend all our time with the people on the outside attacking the people on the inside that's on the same team, and we fail to really attack the actual opponents.
I would agree with that. We had another question. Did you still have a question?
Yeah. Earlier, you talked about how abortion just takes the spotlight when we talk about reproductive rights. Do you see a world where pleasure can take the spotlight? And what can that look like if we move in that direction? Can you repeat?
I'm going to repeat that. Okay, so the question was essentially, and sorry if I paraphrase this poorly, we were talking about abortion taking the spotlight in terms of reproductive rights. Is there a future that can be imagined in which pleasure takes that spotlight?
Well, I've always written that we in the pro-choice movement made a strategic mistake in not calling ourselves the pro-sex movement. Because a lot more people want to have sex than need abortions. And we are definitely up against the anti-sex movement. And so we kind of like went to only the outcome and not the pleasure, thinking about mistakes that we've made in the past. Now, one mistake that I think we're making currently, though, is that we've entered a brand of feminism that mistakes their desires for feminism. And just because you're a feminist and you desire something doesn't make it a feminist goal, for example. And so we've kind of gotten into an indulgent kind of feminism in some quarters that isn't strategic, it isn't collaborative, and for many of us it's not even pleasurable because it feels very, what's that word? Self-indulgent.
What you're going for.
Well, just self-indulgent. Now, I'm really second wave. But just because you have a desire to do something doesn't mean it's for the benefit of all women and all people who are suffering from oppression. So it's a very capitalist interpretation of feminism. So joy and pleasure are vital to sustainability. A black person knows that. Why do you think we party so hard? We understand that fundamental relationship. But at the same time, partying is no substitute for organizing and action.
Oregon a couple of years ago introduced a sex ed bill. They have since passed it that includes pleasure as part of the mandate of sexual education. They passed this, I think, in 2020. I'm pretty sure if you want to look it up. My colleague, my very dear colleague, she represents the district adjoining me. Her name is Tara Mack. She carried this bill in very Catholic Rhode Island for a couple of years, God bless her. And it did never get any traction as far as becoming law goes, but it provoked a series of really important public conversations about like what it means to think about people's health holistically. I remember having this epiphany when I was like, I don't know, 28 or something. I'm a cis woman, raised in a cis woman's body. And my body I had been taught that my body is a liability, right? Like, how do you not get pregnant when you don't want to be? And how do you not get an STI? That was like the sum total of it. And somewhere in my late 20s, I was like, oh, this is supposed to be fun. Right, okay. But I didn't learn that from the adults in my life, right? I learned that from friends and partners, it's a real waste, right? It's a very disempowering way of thinking about things. And again, when you teach people, and specifically when you teach people whose bodies are minoritized in whatever way, that their body is a liability, first and foremost, it is a very short path going from thinking of your body as a liability to thinking of yourself as a liability, and we do not need that. We do not need that.
Remember, most sex ed is still abstinence-based, fear-based. So the fact that most people aren't learning about pleasure or thinking that pleasure is even a goal is something, which is why I think your book is so important. In terms of trying to reach, yeah, exactly.
There was
The
a
Catholics and the Calvinists were like.
there was a slogan during the AIDS crisis that I think about often I've thought about a lot in the last year, and there aren't too many children around. The slogan went, "When we fuck, we win." And I think about that a lot because I think it's so important. It's joyous in its own way. It confronts the slut shaming and takes away some of the power to say we can win with joy. The winning and the fight does not have to be about negativity and slut shaming and all of these heavy topics. We can take those on because we have joy. And when we fuck, we win.
And just chiming in, I love the approach of looking at it holistically as well. And I don't think it's a binary between, like the joy in sex and, abortion and trying to combat something that you don't want to happen. I think I want a world in which we can encourage people to live in their bodies and experience everything along that spectrum and find pleasure in their bodies and just walk down the street in their bodies and be able to exist without thinking of themselves as either a vessel for shame or a vessel for pleasure, usually with someone else in mind. I want to encourage people to be able to exist in the bodies they have as wholly as they can.
All right, I think we have time for one more if anyone has one. All the way in the back?
Sort of just thought of this, but how would I think in the fight for abortion rights, there are the women out there who have decided they want to be mothers, to stay at home, to that. I'm sure it's talked about in your book, but like what sort of message do you want to say with them to sort of be on this linear track it's okay to be a mom, to want to have a child, but also to protect women's rights and say it's okay to have an abortion as well. So to just make those sort of two thoughts meet.
Well, one of the false dichotomies or right-wing myths is that there are two kinds of people in the world. They're the bad people who have abortions, and they're the good people who are mothers and have children, which we know is absolutely false. So to begin to go back to Mason's point about truth and honesty, and we all know most people who have abortions have children already. So it just doesn't make sense to think in that way. It carves the world up. It imposes a framework on the world that isn't accurate at all. If that is the answer you give. And I don't think but it serves the forces of oppression to divide us in that way. It serves them to think, oh, we don't like children and mothers, which is ridiculous.
And building off of that, the binary thinking is the language of oppression. You have this or that. You have two choices. And that it does such a grave disservice to the beauty and nuance and diversity of human experience and joy and all of this. So I think it's really important when we are approaching these topics, whatever topic it may be that is kind of at the forefront or is being politicized in the moment, when people force a binary, this is right and that is wrong, question that. Take a beat and say, you're giving me two options and forcing a binary when there doesn't need to be one. And so I think that is really important, just perspective in this climate in general. Push back against binaries because they are the language and tools of oppression.
No, I said no, and then I'm gonna run my mouth. Yeah, the thing that we want to do is get people to understand how much they've been lied to and how much they can go in their own family histories and find out the truth. Because many of us don't even stop to have that conversation with our own mothers, our own grandmothers, and ask them about their reproductive histories and stories that are right there in our families, but we haven't had the confidence or the opportunity or even offered them the invitation to tell us what they went through. And that will change a lot of our misbeliefs about what's really going on. What's really going on. Marlene is absolutely right. The majority of people who have abortions already know the reality of having children. They're not doing this because they're confused about what it takes to parent and to give birth and to commit your life to the nurturing of another human being. It's because they know that reality, that they're making the best decisions they can make in the conditions that they're facing, about which we probably don't know a lot, because we make assumptions about them because of their behaviors, not because of who they actually are.
I guess I would say that this is also a moment where we can practice using our imaginations to describe a world in which everyone has the space to make whatever choice works for them, right? Like, it is not about whether I'm making the right, just like, it's nobody's business what choice I make, right? The job is to create a world in which every single person at the table, and that table and everywhere, has the ability to assess their own life and live into the beauty of that life, right? So I think, to your question, part of it is, how can we talk about this differently, right? Like, how do we talk about a world in which, my sister, for instance, has 3 children. 2 are adopted, 1 is biological. There are a lot of reasons that went into that, and her family is configured in one way, my family is configured in a different way. We are also members of each other's family. It's all good, right? It's all good. So how do we reflect those values in our conversations? And I think maybe that's as simple sometimes as a gentle reframing, right? People get defensive when they feel like they're being criticized. There is room enough in the world to build any kind of families that we want, right? And I think that part of our work right now is to celebrate that actively.
When I think about the way you asked it, is, can we imagine? And part of I would say maybe one of the most destructive things that the right wing has done is it's killing off imagination. It's making us think that we can't have these things. Don't ask for too much, because if you do, you won't get anything. Now, of course, we also know that if you don't, you won't get anything. So I think we have to challenge push back against that. And again, the issue of shame is sort of under all of this. Like, don't be ashamed that you want pleasure. Don't be ashamed that you want housing. Don't be ashamed that you want food. These are the basic necessities of human existence.
Thank you all very much for a conversation that I truly could listen to for another couple hours, but I won't. We've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much to all of you for your participation in this panel. Thank you to everybody who's here. And I will remind you that the reason that we have come together with this group of speakers is specifically as a fundraiser as well as a conversation starter. So if you have anything that you can give today, please head over to the register, get books, make donations, think about how you can take some of this wisdom into your own families, your own communities, your own actions, and thank you again.